Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Casualty lists from battles, large and small, were splashed across newspapers in the North and the South during the Civil War. Families and friends pored over lists with dread and a hope and a prayer that they would not find the name of a husband, a father, a son, or a comrade's name. The Battle of Fort Donelson was no exception. In the immediate aftermath of the engagement in February 1862, newspapers published the names of the wounded, the dead, and the missing. The names of senior officers who fell were often reserved for the headlines, much like this one right here. One of those officers, Colonel John Alexander Logan, known affectionately by his men as Black Jack for his dark eyes and hair and swarthy complexion, was reportedly killed leading his regiment, the 31st Illinois Infantry, against the failed breakout attack by Confederate forces on February 15th. Within 24 hours, reports like this one in the Cleveland Leader were reporting the names of the dead. And as you can see here, John A. Logan reported killed. Logan's wife, Mary, saw the news and leapt into action. She didn't see this newspaper. The one she saw was the Telegraph, but the effect was the same. She left her home in Marion, Illinois for the 130-mile trek to Fort Donelson to receive and retrieve her husband's body and bring him home. She told her story, the story of her journey and its outcome, in her 1913 book, Reminiscences of a Soldier's Wife, an autobiography. I want to read to you some of the relevant passages. Her words are a tribute to her grit and determination. They're also a moving eulogy to those who made the ultimate sacrifice. So let me begin. Here's how she gets into the story with the Telegraph newspaper. She writes, "The Telegraph announced that Fort Donelson had fallen February 15th, 1862, and also gave a list of the killed and wounded. In the list of killed appeared the names of Colonel John A. Logan, Lieutenant Colonel John H. White, 4 captains of the 31st Regiment of Illinois, and a great number of the men, all of whom I knew personally. There were many Illinois troops in General Grant's command, and consequently, the state lost heavily in officers and soldiers in the expedition against Forts Henry and Donelson." She continues, "On receipt of the overwhelming news of my husband's death, I started at once for Cairo, Illinois, determined, if it were possible, to go to Fort Donelson at all hazards. Transportation was very limited, and hundreds of people flocked to Cairo, anxious to go up the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers in pursuit of friends who had been killed or wounded. Orders were issued from the War Department to allow no one on board the few transports then at the command of the Army. General Grant was to be reinforced at once so that he could continue to march to Pittsburgh Landing." All of you students of the Civil War know she's talking about Shiloh, and on to Corinth. On my arrival at Cairo, I learned that Colonel Logan was not killed, but was severely wounded, news which made me all the more anxious to join him. Going to Army headquarters at Cairo, I applied for permission to go up the river. The colonel commanding assumed an imperious air, informing me with much emphasis that military necessity compelled him to refuse me a pass. My heart was almost broken. With fast falling tears, I left headquarters, fully intending to go to Fort Donelson if I had to go in a rowboat or cross the river and drive overland. When I reached the hotel, I found that Governor Yates of Illinois and Governor Morton of Indiana had both arrived, and were going to charter steamers to go and bring the wounded and remains of those who had been killed home to their respective states. I hastened to call on them and was assured I could go with either of them. Dear old Colonel Dunlap of Jacksonville, Illinois, brigade quartermaster of McClernand's brigade, was present, and as I passed out of the room, he followed me into the hall and whispered to me the name of the steamer which was going first and which was then being loaded at the wharf. He said, "Slip down to the boat, tell them you are a member of my family, and that you are to wait for me until I come to the boat a few hours later. After you are on board, hide in one of the staterooms, and you will not be disturbed, as, in the meanwhile, I will give such instructions as will protect you." I lost no time in getting to the boat, and, to my delight, found Captain Arter, a friend of hers, in command. Colonel Logan had, a few years before, defended and cleared him of a charge of manslaughter. He was an old rear captain and had gotten into trouble with a roustabout employed on his boat. He welcomed me most cordially and understood without asking that I had no pass. He said, "Come on board and you shall see Logan." He conducted me up a veritable winding stairs to a stateroom on the hurricane deck, and I did not stir abroad until we were underway and the stars were shining. Captain Arter came and knocked on my door, calling out, "The coast is clear. Come down to supper." As we sailed up the river, it seemed like a shoreless sheet of water and ice. As the waters were so high, they extended over acres of ground far outside the banks. Mammoth trees rose out of the water like islands in the sea, and, but for long experience, the pilot could not have kept in the channel. The long gray moss, which hung like mystic veils from all the trees, invested everything with a weird appearance and made one feel he was penetrating into a mysterious land. We arrived at an early hour in the morning, and as we approached, we saw the stars and stripes flying over ramparts of Fort Donelson. As we neared the landing, our boat almost touched the guards of the decks of the steamer Uncle Sam, upon which were General Grant's headquarters. Recognizing me, a number of the officers who came out on the deck hailed me, telling me to come on board. General Grant, having had both Colonel Ransom of the 11th Illinois Infantry, and Colonel Logan carried to his headquarters after the surrender. That's a surrender of Confederate troops on February 16th. In a briefer time than it has taken to write the story, I was ascending the companionway of the Uncle Sam to find my husband lying on a cot with his left arm strapped to his body. It having been wounded near the point of the shoulder, the rifle ball passing through the shoulder joint, another ball struck the pistol he carried in his belt and nearly broke his ribs, from which he suffered almost as much as from the wound in the arm and shoulder. Colonel Ransom and Colonel Logan lay on cots side by side on the Uncle Sam, where General Grant had done the very best he could for them. From the severe weather and exposure, hundreds had come down with pneumonia and typhoid fever. Transportation was so limited that General Grant could not send the sick and wounded north as rapidly as he desired. He therefore took possession of the many vacant houses and tried to establish hospitals to make the sufferers as comfortable as possible, with the thermometer below zero and meager supplies attainable. As soon as possible, therefore, I made my two patients, Colonels Ransom and Logan, much happier than they had been, as I had not been so improvident as to go to Colonel Logan empty-handed, but had hastily laden clothing, delicacies, and many necessities for the relief of the sick and wounded. As I was the eldest of a family of 13, my education in caring for the sick and preparing the proper diet for invalids had not been neglected, and so I lost no time in finding the stewards and their kitchens. Only those who have had like experience can appreciate what a sponge bath of alcohol and hot water, clean clothes, and nourishing food meant to those brave men after the long, weary hours of suffering and discomfort that they had endured from the hour they had fallen on the bloody field. After ministering to their relief, and when they were sleeping quietly, I went with some friends to look after those whom we knew were either sick or wounded and had been carried to improvised hospitals. We also attended the burial service, which was held over the brave men of the 11th and 31st Illinois regiments that had fought so bravely. While life lasts, I shall never forget the sight upon which I looked through tears on the battlefield. The long trenches had been dug by their weary comrades. The heroic dead had been brought and laid side by side in them. Their overcoats and blankets were wrapped about their lifeless forms. Tents were ripped so as to make tarpaulins with which to cover them. Chaplains standing close to the center with uncovered heads prayed fervently for peace to the souls of the gallant dead about to be laid to rest in Mother Earth, where they would sleep their last sleep till the trump of the resurrection should call them to glory in that land where wars can never come. After the bugler's long, sad notes, I turned away with unspeakable sadness from this, the first interment on a battlefield I had ever witnessed, appreciating more keenly than I had ever done before the melancholy significance of the words, quote, buried on the field where they had fallen, end quote, and realizing that it was barely possible after sanguinary engagements to pay as much tribute to the dead as had been done in this one of the early battles in the West during the Civil War. So there you have the words of Mary Logan, the wife of Colonel John A. Logan of the 31st Illinois Infantry. Logan, of course, well known to you students of the Civil War, went on to be a top commander in the Western Theater, serving with Grant and Sherman and others through the remainder of the war. Thanks for listening. We'll see you the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.